And welcome to part 1 of the Preservation Week web series, Moving Image Preservation 101. I'm Allison Armstrong, a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee, and will be your host for this afternoon's webinar. Our presenter today is Siobhan Hagan, the audiovisual archivist at the University of Baltimore. Siobhan graduated from NYU's Moving Image Archive and Preservation program and began her career at the UCLA Library in 2011. In January of 2014, Siobhan began working at the University of Baltimore as the first audiovisual archivist. Her passion is the preservation and access of regional audiovisual materials and collections, as well as the immediate reformatting of magnetic tape as the world nears a catastrophic loss of recordings stored on these ephemeral and obsolete formats. A few things to keep in mind for today's presentation. Today's webinar does not have interactive chat capabilities. If you wish to comment on today's presentation using Twitter, you may use the hashtag you see on the screen. However, we will not be monitoring the Twitter feed. If you have questions for Siobhan, please type them into the question box on your screen, and she will answer them during the presentation or at the end. Any questions which remain unanswered while we're on the air will be answered offline, and the answers will be sent to all attendees. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email with links to the recording, the presentation slides, and an evaluation within 2 days. Please take time to fill out the evaluation form, since it will be used by the committee to plan future events. There may be a slight delay as I turn the presentation over to Siobhan.
Great. Thank you so much, Allison, and thank you everyone for being here today. My name is Siobhan Hagan, and I am the audiovisual archivist at the University of Baltimore, and welcome to Moving Image Preservation 101. Basically today, and that's me with my fancy hat on, so just so you have a face and a name to who's speaking at you today about moving images. So initially I want to start off first with basically my favorite Latin, because I'm a huge nerd, obviously, and took Latin in high school. And my favorite Latin phrase is audio, video, disco. And that means I hear, I see, I learn. And that just is so potent and to me as an audiovisual archivist. I'm a little biased, obviously, but I think audiovisuals are especially powerful in studying pretty much anything that they document: history, humanities, arts, culture. So as I said, I'm very biased, but hopefully today I can help convince you to not only to preserve your moving images, but help you to start that process. So just to start off, what we see and we hear in this world of ours are wavelengths of various frequencies. So we have sound frequencies and wavelengths, and light frequencies and wavelengths and spectrums. There are 2 ways to record these wavelengths: as an analog signal. You've probably heard of that before, analog. And then also as a digital signal. I'm positive everyone has heard of digital. So basically, an analog signal is analogous to the original wavelength, or frequency that you hear, and that you can actually physically, see when you see sound wavelengths. That is basically analogous to that original, what you're hearing. And that's why it's called analog. As for digital, that records the wavelengths in ones and zeros, or basically on and off switches, which is how computers record things in general, and pretty much do everything in ones and zeros. So you can take your analog signal or your signals and then record them. You know, we talk about recording them, but what do you record them onto? So an analog signal can be recorded onto, and has always been recorded onto, a physical, some sort of physical material or item, something you can hold in your hands. I know these two terms are a bit difficult, and so the two terms of physical, you know, items, and then born digital. Basically, I know there are many archivists out there that actually hate the term born digital, and this term basically means that you have a file or a video, in this case, that was, you know, basically born as a digital file. So anything that you have on your cell phone, if you take a video on your cell phone, you recorded it as a digital file immediately. So you can, to compare that to the other type of digital signal recording, you can also record a digital signal onto a physical tape. So you may have seen some tapes out there, and I'll show you some today in this presentation, that actually, while they're a physical tape, they have a digital signal recorded onto the videotape. So to start off, I think it would be great for us, we have this awesome ability to have polls here. So basically, I wanted to ask this first poll, kind of gauge the audience, and this first poll is, why are you taking this webinar? So this will help me. So I'm going to launch this, and it'll pop up, and then if you guys could all answer with some specific answers that we have there, it's basically just choose which one is the most right for you, and I'll give you a couple seconds to answer it. All right, so I'm going to close this poll because give you one more second. I see most of you have voted, so I'm going to close the poll and take a look at the results. So it seems like the majority of you have said, you know, that you're curious. Well, let's see, to learn the next steps in the preservation of the audiovisual formats that you have. It seems kind of split in between, that's the majority, but to recognize AV formats, okay, and inherent preservation problems, and no specific objectives. So just to let you all know, today I definitely am going to introduce the most, so basically the most ubiquitous audiovisual formats, specifically in the consumer realm. So there are a lot of AV formats that professionals have used over the years. There's just tons of AV formats out there, honestly. But I really think it's important to focus in on the ones that, if you have your own home movie collection or your own personal collection that you inherited from your family, or you work at a small library that has you know, just a small amount of items that, you know, if you work for a university that was taken over the years and gathered and collected. These are going to be the most ubiquitous formats that you see in those types of collections, because these were the formats that that were the cheapest to use and the easiest to use. Unfortunately, their preservation is neither cheap nor easy, as we will see. All right. So, great. So this next slide, results, poll closed. Okay, so this next slide, we're going to start talking about film motion picture film, which was the first audiovisual format in the history of all of them. So the first type of moving image analog signal, as we discussed before, this is definitely an analog signal, was recorded onto motion picture film. And motion picture film was introduced in 1885. Now, many years, maybe many years before that, a couple of decades before that, was when still photography was introduced and really caught on. And from that is where, because it's the basic same technology of photochemistry that you get your motion picture film, but you're dealing with a lot more of these small still images that create a moving image. So the first standardized format was 35mm film, and this has to do with the width of the film. So if you see here on this slide here, that you basically, obviously you can have multiple lengths of the film, but when you look at the different sizes, you'll see that at the top here we have the smaller width of the films, and then at the bottom they're larger in width. So the biggest basically one that was the first standardized film format was 35mm wide, and that was more of the professional gauge, and that was the professional gauge of film, and that's small gauge, and large gauge is basically just a terminology I wanted to throw out there for it's just the format. So, and it's basically asking what size that you have in the width. So the smaller, they started out with 35mm wide, and then and that was professional use. It was very expensive initially, and then they decided to make film smaller, not less than 35mm. The smaller you make your film, the less expensive it is to be a filmmaker, and thus the more you will find in your collections. So basically, if we run through the most popular amateur film formats, also these most popular ones, the most ubiquitous ones, the cheapest ones are known as the small gauge formats. And you will most likely find these in home movies, etc. So the first small gauge format was 16mm, which basically what they did was take 35 and split it down the middle. And here's an example you can see here. It started in 1923 is when they first released a 16mm amateur film option. And so it was cheaper, and it was made with a new type of film. So there are different types of film, what they're actually, the plastic, because film is basically made of plastic, the bulk of what it's made on. And there were different types of plastic that was made, and this specific type that was then introduced was safer. It's made of acetate is what it's called. And its predecessor was nitrate, which you may have heard of before. So this acetate was safer for non-professional use, because nitrate, you really needed to be a professional when you were working with it in a camera, and also as a projectionist, because it was flammable. And there were actually a couple accidents with nitrate film where professionals were not using, were not projecting it, and there were many serious fires in different movie theaters. So 16, magnetic stripe is something I want to throw out there as well, and you'll see why when we talk about preservation issues especially. It basically, as you see, it's that brown stripe on the bottom of the film. So here with the film you can also see that there are different, in between the little holes on the side at the top, there are different still images that you see, and that is what a moving image in film is. It's a 24, typically it's 24 of those still images shown at such a quick pace that your eye gives it the illusion of movement. And it's 24 frames per second that you visually can see. And then on the bottom there, the brown stripe, or magnetic stripe, was introduced in the 70s for specifically this type of amateur filmmaking, and basically that's a soundtrack. So finally you could put sound on your film, and we'll go into that, why this particular soundtrack, it can be problematic for preservation issues. But first, let's go through and also take a look at 8mm. Now here, it was 8mm was splitting 16 down the middle again. Pretty easy for the manufacturers. It was introduced in 1935, and it made things half as expensive as 16. So you see that as more people can afford to make films, they will make them. So then you will find even more of them in your collections. Then from there, the real home movie maker was Super 8. Super 8, as there was a movie that was put out, started in 1965 and really had a heyday in the 70s, late 60s and the 70s. So in this picture here, you can see these are just white leaders. You can't actually, there's no images recorded onto the film, but this can at least give you a size comparison and give you the differences between, and to be able to tell your film apart. If you just sort of roll into it just a very little bit into the beginning of the film, if you take a look at the width, you just use a ruler really quickly and measure the width, you can see whether it's 16 or 8mm wide, because Super 8 is still 8mm wide, but as you see, Super 8 is on your far right, and the holes along the left side of the film are much smaller than the holes on the previous film. So the film on our left is a 16mm film, and that also has, you'll see that there's two double perfs, so there's perforations on both sides of that film, but that's not necessarily too important for right now. And then in the middle of this photograph, we have regular 8mm, which is 8mm wide, but still has the same size perforations as 16mm. Super 8 was a revolution, the one on your right-hand side, because the perforations were so much smaller, it left so much more space for visual information and then also for soundtrack information that you could put along the side. So you either got better resolution and quality for your images, so that then you could you know, blow it up more, and then also you could people could start recording soundtracks with their film extremely cheaply. So here are the three main types we've got of motion picture film that you will find in your collections. On the left, 16, as I mentioned, 16mm. In the middle, we have 8mm. On the right, Super 8mm. So this brings us to poll number 2. What types of film do you have in your collection? So I'm going to launch that poll. If you guys can, if you know, I know it's very difficult sometimes at this point, but maybe, you know, you're like, oh yeah, that's definitely 16. That's definitely bigger, you know, than an 8mm, or learning the difference between 8mm and Super 8 takes a little bit. You know, basically like doing the comparison, and then you start to learn. Okay, so I'm seeing 43% at this point. I don't know. I really hope that, I know that this webinar is quick, you know, and we only have so many visuals, and you can only see so much through a webinar, but I will be sharing my contact information, and I'm always interested in helping to clarify how you can tell the two apart, or the three of them apart, how you can, you know, tell if it has a soundtrack or not. So as I'm seeing, so I'm going to close that poll and then share the results there so everyone can see. It seems like, well, a lot of people have 16mm. Yeah, so that's great. That definitely seems like people also know what know a little bit of what they have in their collections. So But yes, definitely I will be, I'm always available to help people figure out what they have in their collections, because honestly, I'm just curious. It's fun to me to know what everybody has. So next, we're going to talk about basically the preservation problems of motion picture film so that you guys can start knowing what to do. So the biggest thing is, as I mentioned before, nitrate film, you're not going to run into this. And here we have, this is how you would even figure out that you have nitrate film. Nitrate says nitrate on it, and acetate normally says safety film on it because it was safe. It was safer. Although you might have a different, so basically you just know that you will not run into nitrate if you have anything that's any film that's 16 millimeter or smaller. That's a really important thing because people get very worried. But if you 35 is where nitrate existed. So don't worry about nitrate. You're all good there. The biggest thing you're going to run into is vinegar syndrome. And this is because, as I mentioned, you're not dealing with nitrate. You're dealing with acetate. So this is a type of plastic cellulose that is the base of the film, and it's, as I mentioned, so it basically starts turning into acetic acid as it decays. Moisture from the air and heat as well. Basically, the moisture starts to change the molecules within the plastic, and as you can see in these photos, you know, it starts making the film curl, warp, stick to itself, and you also will smell the acetic acid, which is why it's called vinegar syndrome, because it smells like vinegar. That is the key to knowing that your film collection is starting to turn. Now, when you see it like this, like the picture on the left, when you see that, that's obviously and you're going to smell that. Trust me, it will knock your socks off. Basically, this is not salvageable. This film here. Hopefully, you'll be able to find something in the early stage of vinegar syndrome, and then if you store it properly and digitize it, you should be good to go if you catch it at an early stage. So one thing I did want to mention was that those magnetic soundtracks that I mentioned, the brown stripe along the side of your film, or sometimes you'll also see a film that's entirely brown, which means it's just a magnetic soundtrack. It's magnetic information, it's magnetic particles slapped onto this plastic. And those magnetic particles do not like the acetate cellulose. And it basically speeds up, from what scientists have found, it speeds up the vinegar syndrome and the degradation process. So that's why if you see a brown soundtrack on your film, you're going to want to move that ahead in your preservation priority queue. So mold is also an issue, and that comes with motion picture film, and honestly, any kind of audio-visual material. If you get it wet, it's going to grow mold. If you're in a particularly humid climate, it might grow mold. So really, the main thing here is just film does not like water, and mold loves film. It specifically really loves the image information. That actually holds all the image in it, so it will eat away at that. So you just want to, and there are ways to clean it. You would have to send it to a vendor, but you can clean it. It's not the end of the world if you do have mold. But the key thing here is that it's expensive to clean the mold off. It's not safe to be breathing in this mold, so I would really recommend that you put your moldy items in a plastic bag and then send it to a vendor in order for them to clean it properly in a ventilated area. And basically the idea is that store your film properly, and you will avoid a mold situation, which can get really expensive and resource consuming, as I mentioned, for everyone, whether you work at a library or whether this is just your home movie collection. One other thing to mention is that color film, if you have color film out there, so you can have black and white or you can have color film. Color film, depending on the you know, manufacturer who made it, what year it was made, the very specific type of dyes that were used. It may fade, and also depending on how it was stored. Many times with heat and humidity, color film can fade to many different ways, but mostly this is the worst, as you see here, where it fades to all but magenta. All the other dyes basically are gone, and the only thing that exists then is the magenta. So this is something that you might see, and you know, you can also sort of date films sometimes based on seeing that. So that's something to consider with storage. Many times it might just be dependent on the film stock, but then also many times you can at least salvage it by storing the film physically properly, which we'll talk about in a minute. So here we are. We want to talk about how to store your film. This is considered poor housing here. And here, just to point out, this is an example. You see the brown, you see how this film is brown there. That is a magnetic soundtrack, a full magnetic soundtrack. So not only is that a higher preservation priority, but it's also wrapped up in a plastic bag. So both of them are wrapped up in their own plastic bags, which film has much organic elements to it, and it wants to breathe. Definitely the best thing to avoid vinegar syndrome is to have a container that, you know, allows airflow, and a plastic bag does quite the opposite, and many times metal cans as well. Basically, it traps all of the vapors inside of this small contained area, and then it feeds on itself. It's an autocatalytic process, vinegar syndrome is. So the more that you trap the vapors, the worse the vinegar syndrome will get. So you want to take your film out of plastic bags. You know, ideally you'd want it in a ventilated container, which here we have these, you know, one of the films that has been rehoused for preservation. So here it has, this film has a preservation core, which is that blue circular plastic core in the middle, circular item in the middle that is inert plastic, which basically means it chemically does not react with anything that is in the film, with any of the chemicals in the film. It will not exacerbate the vinegar syndrome at all. And then the container itself that you see, the blue container, is also made of inert plastic. And you maybe can see at the top there, there's a little slit in the container as well. And this also has a lid, which I didn't show here, but there are slits in these containers, and and the film sits on these little raised ridges. So airflow can get in through the little slits, and then the film sits on top of these little bumps and ridges, and the airflow just goes right through, and the film is a happy little film. So this is the ideal state. Realistically, you need to try and get a happy medium between the two. You know, you have your original film containers. That's understandable. If they're metal, maybe perhaps you can, you know, figure out a way to just take the film out and then maybe just punch a few little holes in there with a screwdriver and a hammer or something, just to get some airflow going. By the way, I'm very DIY with my preservation, if you couldn't tell, and with our own home movies and things like that. These few things could really help. Obviously, they're not necessarily the best practices, but they are very realistic, and they will help the longevity of your motion picture film. Another thing that you want to do for your film is, this is poor storage for the film. You want to store your film flat. So film, you know, here we see a bunch of film cans on their side, and these are also in metal containers. And you know, there's paper there. You want to take the paper out, because paper also has acids in it themselves, especially older paper has acids in it. So you want to take those pieces of paper out of storage with the film. Just kind of note somewhere what that, you know, you can either write what's on the paper on the can, or just somehow make sure that you put a number on both the can and the paper so that you can relate the paper back to its original film somehow, so that you don't lose that those two went together at some point. But you just don't want to store your paper inside of the container with your film. And then you want to store your film flat, and F for film is flat. And then you want to store your film ideally in, you know, so ideally it would be in a very cold room with low humidity. Typically people, you know, want to store at least in the 50-degree Fahrenheit realm, and then people sort of say, you know, 30% relative humidity, if people even, you know, keep track of that, or able to keep track of that. It's very hard to keep. The main thing that you want is a consistent temperature and relative humidity for your film. The more that your temperature and your humidity fluctuates, the worse it is for the film in coming down with vinegar syndrome. So you want to put your film somewhere dark as well. You don't want to expose it to much UV or sun at all. I really don't recommend storing it in an attic or a basement. Basement, you're gonna worry about flooding, and also, you know, bugs do actually like to eat bits of film as well, because as I mentioned, that was organic materials. And then also your attic normally gets too hot, and also you can get leaks in your roof and things like that. Honestly, I think the more realistic place to store your film, if you're, you know, if these are home movies, is just a cool, dry place that, like a closet. To me, that seems like a bedroom closet. It's dark. It's typically, you're going to have, it's going to be human comfort levels, you know, so you don't really, most people don't like things fluctuating that much, at least for human comfort. And that'll be your best bet and most realistic bet. So that's that for storage. Other film best practices or ideal or, you know, realistic practices are to keep the originals. So that's something that happened to my family that I am very, very sad about, is that we had this beautiful 16mm color footage that my grandfather took of the family, and sometime in the late 1980s and early 1990s, someone made a VHS copy of the originals, and then the originals were thrown out because they were taking up too much space. And, you know, nobody had a projector anymore to take a look at it. But 16mm film is much higher quality than a VHS copy. So, and also will last longer, as we'll see, than, because photochemical motion picture film will last longer than your VHS tapes. So unfortunately, all we have are those VHS tapes. So the other thing, you want to keep your originals and store them, as I mentioned, as best you can. And you know, so you keep the originals, but ideally you will digitize them in order to be able to watch them and provide access to these movies, because we want to. That's part of preservation, is making things accessible. So then, in other ways, to be able to watch the content, so then you don't have to go back to the originals. You don't have to physically put that film through a projector, which damages the film each time that you put it in a projector. It is possible to project film safely, but you have to be a very, very experienced projectionist, and sort of like a projectionist archivist, and there's not many of those in the world today. So I really recommend that you don't project in most situations, that you go and get a digital copy, but then also keep your originals. So, So next up, I want to talk about video, because as I mentioned, what do I do when I had these original 16mm and now all I have is VHS copies. And then also, most of my family home movies from when I was younger are all on video. So the whole, as I mentioned, Super 8mm was really the last amateur film format. And that was, that started in 1965 and ran through the 70s. Honestly, some people, mostly artists, do still work on Super 8 and even 8mm and 16mm film still. But in 1956, videotape was introduced into the market. Now, in the 50s, video was originally just introduced in the professional realm. It wasn't until this half-inch open reel format came around in 1965, same time as Super 8, where video was finally somewhat portable. People could, instead, you didn't need these huge machines that were as big as, 3 people and weighed just tons. There was actually a portable video system, as you can see, and it was just a much smaller format as well. So, and the whole, not only was video cheaper than film, especially 16mm film, but what the real draw was that people could instantly view what they had just recorded. And that was really novel. I know it's tough to imagine nowadays where we can just view our cell phone videos immediately or stream video live. At that time, that was so new and so important, where film, you have to record your motion picture film and then you send it to your developer, and normally that would at the most take 2 days to get back your film and see how everything turned out. With video, it was immediate, and you could record over what you had just recorded. So if you didn't like it, you didn't have to buy a whole nother cartridge of film and spend even more money. You could just record over it and try something new. So it really opened up a lot of creative areas. A lot of artists like to use this, initially like to use this type of video, the half-inch open reel video. A lot of activists like to use it initially in the early days of it. So that's why I wanted to bring up this specific format of video that you may find in your collections. It wasn't as ubiquitous as we'll get into the other video collections or video formats, but you may find this in your collection. And so the sizes of those reels, you'll see it's an open reel video. So the tape itself is video, which and that means that it is a magnetic tape, and it has magnetic particles on a polyester base, so not like the acetate base that most motion picture film you'll find has. But so this, you can't actually see physically what is on the item. And as you'll see here, it's a reel, just like a reel of film, where we're used to seeing, which like I'll show in this next format, it's a cassette that normally we're used to seeing our video onto hubs or reels inside of a plastic cartridge or cassette tape. Whereas here, you're just going to find this out in the open. It's and basically the half-inch, if you just measure just like your 35 and your 16 and your 8mm film, you measure the width of it, and if it's at a half-inch and it's in this open reel container, you'll know that that is what you have for your video format. There are other sizes. There's, you'll typically find half-inch open reel. Like I said, that was the big open reel amateur format or smaller format. But you could also potentially find 1-inch wide video in your collection, or maybe even 2-inch potentially. But those were more professional broadcast formats. So moving to the next video format that you could potentially find in your collections as a smaller video format is 3/4 inch, or also known as U-Matic video cassette. So this was a format that was introduced in 1971, and it was really, it wasn't typically used for home movies or anything like that. It was typically used in news gathering because people could, local TV news stations could take these cassettes out into the field, and it was much more portable, even more portable than half-inch open reel, and it was a higher quality, visual quality, so they could actually then broadcast it, and it would be enough visual quality for people actually to see what was going on. So here on the left you see just the video cassette format of U-Matic. There's an example of a video player, because video cassettes, any type of video tape or magnetic tape is very tied into its playback deck, because as I mentioned, you hold up a piece of video to the light, you don't see anything. There's no visual information there because it's very different than film, where film, you hold it up to the light, you can see at least the pictures there. You can start getting an idea of what this content will hold. For magnetic tape, you have to have that playback deck, and you have to have multiple machines and obsolete or no longer manufactured machines in order to know even what the content is, and even to be able to access it as well. So here is U-Matic. Once again, you might not find this in your collections, especially as home movies, but now we're getting into the much more home movie centric, like videotape and magnetic tape. Betamax basically came around in 1975 is when it was initially introduced, and it was very popular for recording programs off of your TV and then watching it later. It was very exciting news, and so people did also use it for home movies and things like that, but the biggest, most popular use was recording and watching things later. And basically, there was a war, you may have heard, between Betamax and VHS. Betamax was actually slightly better in visual quality, but for one reason or another, VHS won out as the brand that we all know and either love or hate, as, you know, what people would buy their commercial, you know, Disney puffy video case movies and then watch at home from Blockbuster or whatever, and then also people would record their home movies onto this format. So this is VHS. I'm sure you will find, I think it's probably the most ubiquitous magnetic tape format out there. And VHS actually started in 1976, so Betamax came out, and shortly after, VHS came out and won that war and stuck around for a really long time. The next format I want to mention as far as magnetic tape goes is there's a whole family of 8mm wide, gets a little confusing there then because this is not motion picture film, but 8mm wide video. It's so this one is video 8, and initially 8mm video started in 1984. There were many different versions that came from that. So video 8 was one. Many times, as you'll see here, so here's the tape, you know, it says 8mm on it, so luckily it's not very difficult to be able to tell what your video formats are, especially video cassettes. Here we have another version of the 8mm video family. It says high 8 there on it, so that then you'll know what type of form of playback equipment you need. Now digital 8 here is in the lower left hand of the photograph. I just wanted to show you the one on top is a audio compact cassette, and then there are some other video formats around it, so you can see the smallness. You can see how videos basically, you know, we first had video in an open reel format, then it became contained in a cassette, and then from the cassette it just got smaller and smaller and smaller. And now anytime that you see a D or a digital in your video name, that's when you have a physical video format where, you know, it's on magnetic tape, so you still have the same preservation problems as magnetic tape, but it's not recorded as an analog signal. It's recorded as ones and zeros. So that's important to remember, but you still need a playback deck to to get the audiovisual content off of that. So it's still going to be a higher preservation priority for you. Last but not least is the MiniDV video format, and the DV stands for digital video. And it is very mini. I'm pretty sure everyone has probably seen these little cassette tapes. They were first introduced in 1995, and most people are actually, they could potentially still be using them in various camcorders. But this was definitely a consumer format, and is a lower resolution, but as it was super portable, extremely lightweight equipment, and you could store hours on one tape. So it was definitely, and it was definitely higher resolution than like the high 8 video and the regular 8 video of its time. And then it was also a digital signal that was being recorded. So you'll definitely find, I believe, a lot of these in your more recent home movies. So here we go. We're going to go for poll number 3. You probably have an idea of maybe what I'm going to ask. What types of physical video do you have in your collection? Unfortunately, we couldn't fit all of the options in there that we went over because video, there's just so many formats. But I have here some 1/2-inch open reel. You can choose that one. U-Matic, aka 3/4 inch, VHS, and then we have this other where if you want to type it into the question box, then we can take a look and kind of see. Unfortunately, yeah. Oh yes, VHS is just winning the day, of course. That makes complete sense. 88%, yeah. So yes, the winner and still champion is by far and away VHS. So that doesn't surprise me at all. It's great to see. Honestly, I did not expect to see. This is really fun for me to see the results of these. I'm surprised that there's a lot of 1/2-inch open reel out there, and I'm just going to let you guys know that is a high priority for your preservation list. I would get that digitized before any of the other formats that I talked about. So basically, in order to talk about the preservation priorities and how to make those. Obviously, anything with mold, you can have mold on your videotapes as well. And as I mentioned, most any type of AV, you can definitely have mold. So that would be a high preservation priority, but ideally you would store your video where it's not going to get wet, so you won't have to deal with that. But you will have to send it out to a professional. Sticky shed syndrome. Now this is sort of the vinegar syndrome for video. As you can see here, this is actually from audio, but it's all magnetic tape. Okay, so any kind of magnetic tape where you have magnetic particles on polyester base, once that moisture gets to it too much, and of course depending on what magnetic particles are exactly used, how it was stored, etc., you may get sticky shed syndrome where the magnetic particles have started to break down due to the moisture, and basically the particles just start flaking off, and you'll see just the information just literally flying off as you put it through its playback equipment, and you're losing that information. There are professional ways to deal with that. A vendor needs to get involved in that instance where they physically will bake your item to get that moisture out. But obviously that's a dangerous endeavor. It has to be done slowly for many hours over a course of several days sometimes. So that's definitely something. If you pop a video into its playback deck and you hear any kind of squealing or noises that aren't a smooth run, you want to stop your playback immediately, eject the video, and that's how you know you need to send it. If you really want to get that information digitized off of your video, you have to send it to a vendor so they can deal with that. So video best practices. You have to digitize your video. Where film, you can store it, you can store it in a cool, dry place, and it will last much longer studies have shown, especially frozen film can last for years. But cool, dry, it can definitely last for 100 or so years. For video, we do not have much time left. If it's basically to break down the problems other than the sticky shed, which is the degradation here, we also have the obsolescence of not just of the video itself, so no longer are these video formats manufactured or made. The knowledge around their technology is being lost because no one teaches this type of video engineering anymore because no one actually usually needs to use this technology. So that's where the obsolescence comes in from a knowledge standpoint, and then also from the fact that these machines that you absolutely need in order to play back these audiovisual materials are no longer being manufactured. You need, if you have a broken U-Matic deck, there are only a handful of people that know in this country that know how to fix that. So with this obsolescence degradation perfect storm, which has been coined degrolescence by Mike Casey, an archivist in the field. This is the biggest problem, and which basically how you fight that is you need to digitize. And digitize at a high quality, utilizing a vendor. Now, this also leads to the fact that you then need to preserve your digital files. That's that's definitely an involved endeavor, and can get a bit expensive to do all the digitization, and then also figuring out how to store your digital files. One thing also that typically people talk about that you'll want to know if you can't quite afford to digitize yet, which I would really recommend you doing within the next 5 to 10 years for your video, store them vertically like a book. Where film likes to be flat, video likes to be vertical. Just really quickly, I'd like to talk just about your Born Digital files. So you can get Born Digital files through your cell phones, as I mentioned here, and then there are lots of other ways. And your cell phone videos are much lower resolution than any of the videos many times that we talked about. So really quickly, we'll just do poll number 4. Figure out what type of Born Digital videos do you guys have out there for your home movies, for your, I'd be interested to know if any collecting or libraries are collecting Born Digital videos, but and then we have a consumer camcorder, and then digital cameras. You can just buy those small ones, and every sort of digital camera and cell phone nowadays can take both still images and video. So right now we'll reach 50s. Okay, great. Wow, 70s. So close poll. I'll share the results. Majority of people have a digital camera, a separate digital camera that they have taking their Born Digital videos. So that's really interesting. So for further thoughts about your AV, basically, always remember to write down or type down in a Word doc or an Excel sheet, a spreadsheet, what your labels say, or if you have paper that goes with an item that you take out, on the original physical objects. You never want to totally lose that information that goes with the content. So you want to keep that together with your video files that you digitize. And then also another suggestion is if you have home movies or something where people who experienced these videos or lived through them or know who the people are in them, I recommend either videotaping or recording them speaking over watching the film, and they're giving their documentation of verbally identifying people, places, and events and dates of what they see. It's a really interesting way, and then you save that file with the other file, that digital video file. It's a really interesting sort of way to preserve the information in those in your original videos. Another thing, so digital preservation, as I mentioned really quickly, of both your digitized videos, film, and Born Digital videos. This requires a lot. Many times the big thing that we say in preservation is this locks. Lots of copies keep stuff safe. So you're going to want to have multiple copies but then, you know, in many different geographic regions, but then there are other aspects that you should learn. And I really recommend this other webinar that Alex is putting together on April 30th, entitled Digital Preservation for Individuals and Small Groups. So reach out to this community and hopefully learn more about what you do with those digitized files and how to make sure you have access to those, because preservation is never over. We have to keep maintaining and being aware, much like most of life. So another thing to look into is personal digital archiving. So this is the Library of Congress, I believe, website where there's lots of information out there that's really accessible. You don't have to be a preservation professional that can help you deal with your, you know, not just your home movies, your emails, your still images, lots of digital content that we all have and that's growing every day. Another thing, especially for video, is I want to mention the Center for Home Movies. I provide the link there. Center for Home Movies, every fall there is a home movie day held worldwide where you just come and bring your home movies, and then you have your professional archivists and you have your professional projectionists, and you can actually screen your home movies that you haven't seen for a really long time, and maybe figure out if you want to get these things digitized or not. And then you can ask your professional archivists that are there volunteering for some professional preservation help. So those are some further resources. I am always available. This is my email, shagan@ubalt.edu, and then my Twitter handle is below. So thank you so much for attending this webinar. We have a little bit for questions, and I just want to say happy Preservation Week to you all, and happy preserving. So, need to see my... Okay, so as far as the questions go, let's see. I see film dating back to 1950s. Oh, local TV stations, that's definitely we have a lot of local TV stations in our collection here at UB. I want to make sure I answer question. Let's see, videotapes. Does it need to be stored in a refrigerator? So I'm assuming that that is for film. Don't definitely never store your video or any kind of magnetic tape in a fridge. I definitely would say that a freezer could work for your motion picture film, as long as it doesn't have that magnetic stripe audio soundtrack on it, because as I mentioned, any kind of magnetic material, it does not like to be frozen and is not good for it. It will damage it. So you could potentially store it in a refrigerator, but I would say, as I mentioned, if you have some sort of power outage or anything, then you know you're going to deal with the fact that your film is going from very cold to not cold and potentially really warm in a short amount of time. So as long as you can, you know, deal with that risk, you could put it in a refrigerator, but you know that it's going to hopefully you have a backup generator. That would be great, so you don't have to worry about that. Here in Baltimore, unfortunately, we have a lot of issues with infrastructure and whatnot, and we'd rather have it in a more stable environment regularly than freeze it and then worry about having it thaw poorly. And when you thaw from going from freezing to not freezing too quickly, then you could have potential for mold because you get condensation that forms on the film. So I would say go with more consistent than thinking of cold. Are you recommending storing film flat even if it's on a reel? Yes, I definitely, if it's on a reel, definitely flat. Basically, it spreads out the any kind of damage that might happen from storage. When you have it stored vertically, more weight is being put on one end of the film, and that's shown to cause some edge damage to your film. And motion picture film, your edges are really, really important because that's how you move your film. So those little holes, those are really important. You really want to keep that that structure because that's how it moves through all of its equipment. So storing flat in a shipping box is not a sound idea. I mean, flat is definitely better than vertically, so that's good. Shipping box, I'm not sure exactly what that means. Is a cardboard box. Cardboard would not necessarily be as ideal as plastic or you know, some other kind of, but whatever you have, it's better than nothing. But just make sure that it's not like flaking off or really dirty. Yeah. So could you recommend some resources, books, websites on video preservation? Definitely. I could email those out to yes.
And this is Allison. I'm going to cut in. We're coming up on 3 o'clock, or my time. So I'm going to cut Siobhan off, and we have all of the questions that you all have posted, and I really appreciate all of the great questions. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up, and we'll definitely send out all of the questions and answers and her slides and the recording. So I want to thank Siobhan for her presentation and want to thank you all for attending this webinar. And I want to thank Iping Chen Kapi for providing technical support and recording it. And we hope that you will attend the other parts of Preservation Week web series this week. And we will we'll look for future ALCTS programs on the website on your screen. And please fill out the evaluation when you receive it to help us develop more programs that you're interested in. And again, thank you for coming.